Hello, with me today is Dr. Rob Lutton of the Department of History. And Dr. Lutton works on religion in the later Middle Ages. And he's going to address the question, why study heresy? Rob, you're very welcome. Why do historians find the study of heresy valuable?
Okay, well, I think I ought to start out by talking about my own interest in it and what gets me going about the study of heresy. Heresy is actually quite a narrow category in the Middle Ages. So it's something that you call someone else. It's always something that you call someone else. You define them as a heretic. It's a judicial, it's a legal category. But for me, it gives me insights into diversity of belief. So heterodoxy rather than orthodoxy. So variety and diversity. So it provides evidence of the reaction of the church in the Middle Ages to religious heterodoxy and diversity. Now, a lot of the time, religious diversity isn't troublesome to the church, but when it becomes an issue, when it begins to challenge ideas, doctrines, practices that are deemed very important to the medieval church, and that's when people begin to be defined as heretics. So it provides us insights into that diversity of belief that a lot of the time in the evidence we can't get at, because most of the time the evidence is deliberately and is working hard, because of the people who produce it and their own interests, it's working hard to give us a picture of uniformity and consensus, a happy picture of the church and of popular belief. And how that is largely in accord with clerical ideas about what people ought to believe, so the ideas of priests and monks, essentially. And so the evidence that the investigation of heresy throws up and the codification, categorization of heretics that produces is one of the few ways in which we can begin to get at that diversity, the ways that individuals and groups have a propensity in history to shape the ideas that they're given into new forms that match their experience, that are more appropriate to how they live their lives, if you like.
And of course, there is the myth that is used by clergy throughout the Middle Ages, that somehow or other their beliefs, the beliefs they term orthodoxy, are somehow immune to the ravages of time. And they forget, of course, that even their own orthodoxy is changing with each generation as they re-inherit and reinterpret texts.
Yes.
So you, in a sense, are doing that most characteristic thing of the historian, which is watching the movement of thought.
Yes, absolutely, and ideas that are okay to discuss in the 12th century, for example, and that are being debated. Ideas about the doctrine of the Eucharist, which is so central to medieval popular religion, that by the 14th century and 15th centuries in England, the period that I work on most, have become things that you really mustn't talk about. They become a no-go zone, even increasingly for the people who are actually, whose job it is to talk about those things, and that's professional religious thinkers, theologians.
Yeah, well, of course, there's a fascinating way in which it's actually an English theologian that invents this concept of transubstantiation. And you find in the 13th century, thinkers know it's so problematic that they're almost trying to find ways around using this, to avoid this word. And yet, of course, by the time you come into the 14th century, on the one hand, it's becoming orthodoxy that cannot be challenged, and yet it's at that very moment that we find popular movements rejecting the whole notion.
Yeah, so absolutely, and the groups that the people that I've focused on in my own work have problems with those doctrines because of their own experience of witnessing the Eucharist, of witnessing the Mass, and saying, hang on a minute, how do we believe that? It doesn't seem to match my perceptions. It doesn't seem to match my experiences.
Part of the purpose of this video is to introduce the whole idea of studying heresy as an important way of getting an insight into past societies.
Yes.
Now, I know you work on 14th and 15th century British material, and England in particular.
Yeah.
Would you mind if I took you to southern France? And I think you know where I'm going to take you. I'm going to take you into the foothills of the Pyrenees, in the Ariège and Montaillou. Because here's a fascinating, here, just because one inquisitor was, I think we'd probably call him anally retentive today, but he wanted to write down everything.
Yeah.
You know, we have this incredible body of material, and then we have the genius of turning a body of court reports and reports that were collected, and turning them into a vision of a medieval town, Montaillou. Could you introduce Montaillou to us?
Yes, I mean, I think you're right about the anal retentiveness of Bernard Guy, and you know that obsessiveness of the. I mean, he isn't just a hunter of heretics. He is, it seems, interested in these ideas, although opposed to them. Yeah. And he's interested in the rationalities, the alternative rationalities that he's uncovering. But Montaillou is an example, and those records are an example of how evidence of heresy tells us as much about the inquisitor as it does about the heretical subject. I mean, this is one of the really interesting and big debates that will run and run, I think, about heresy and inquisitorial evidence. And the central question is, to what extent can we move beyond the preconceptions of the inquisitor, someone like Bernard Guy, and to what extent is it actually telling us about the people that he was investigating, or rather is it telling us about his preconceptions and the things he wanted to find out? And you know, one of the key debates in continental heresy now is, you know, did Cathars really exist? Is this a historical construct? Is it something that the inquisitors and then historians since the Middle Ages have actually invented? You know, in the Middle Ages, they invented an enemy which served certain purposes, political purposes, and since then, you know, certain historians have now said, well, academics, historians have run with this term and built, you know, added to that myth in order to build academic careers. And in fact, when we look at the evidence a bit harder, we find that yes, there is religious diversity, but there wasn't such a thing as a Cathar church or a grand Cathar conspiracy.
You mentioned there another aspect of heresy, and that is the heresy and power. Because, of course, by labelling another a heretic and putting that person outside of the group, you are, in a sense, able to identify people who are socially dangerous as well. And so there's an interest in heresy, not just on the part of the church, but on the part of power itself. And well, yes. Obviously, De Heretico Comburendo in England is an example. But
yes,
could we talk about the value of the study of heresy as a study of power?
Yes, it's absolutely fundamental to heresy. So in England in the 14th century, the ideas of John Wycliffe, who's an Oxford academic, in the late 14th century, his ideas challenge certain notions about power, to do with, you know, the power of the church as a landlord and as an authority. His ideas about dominion by grace, you know, ask questions about the basis upon which the church holds power. And in fact, you know, he's a reformer, but he's pushing the reform agenda to quite extreme ends. And those ideas are being picked up by people in secular power, so by the court circle in the late 14th century. And they're being used by people who have an agenda against the church, to disendow the church, to seize more wealth, to further the cause of the English war with France. That's the main thing that's driving that. But as the 14th century goes on, the enemies of Wycliffe and of those ideas come together to actually to challenge Wycliffe's thought around these issues of power. So, for example, perhaps the key turning point in that is the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, where Wycliffe's ideas are seen as inspiring the revolt, and as creating a radical agenda that calls for the disendowment of the church, that calls for all church property to be taken away, for there to only be one bishop, for the ecclesiastical hierarchy to be dismantled. And after 1381, there is a narrative of church and crown moving together to shore up each other's interests, and to react together against the Wycliffite challenge.
So the study of heresy is not merely the study of deviancy within doctrine,
No.
but is an insight into the forces in society and the way those societies constructed themselves and the image of themselves.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So there are ideas within English dissent which are to do with the ways in which people want to lead their lives. They're to do with what is seen by some as the intrusion of the church, of clerics, into everyday life. They're to do with how one uses one's resources, one's property, whether to whom one pays taxes, and to whom one ought to pay taxes. If they're seen as not fulfilling their role in society, then there are those who feel that they ought not to pay taxes to those people to support them in what they should be, because they're not being good priests, for example. And they're also to do with individuals and groups, I think, wanting to think for themselves, and questioning ideas that, the ways in which they're being told by others who are in positions of authority about how to think, about how to lead their lives.
So heresy is about the fundamentals of economic reality and the fundamentals of their own thought world.
Yes, I think that's right. And I mean, one of the things that in my own work that I've tried to do is to relate thought worlds to the realities of everyday life. And so thinking about religion and how it's practiced.
Rob, thank you very much for introducing this fascinating area of historical scholarship to us. Thank you.